Man, do you have a set of wheels?
Get in.
And a quarter-mile Gillis. That's bad.
The nostalgia rap really worked great. How'd the struggling artiste bit go over?
Remember those forgotten 80s TV shows? The ones that got canceled way too soon before they even had a chance? Back then, these shows filled living rooms with laughter, suspense, and characters we came to love in just a few short weeks. What did we lose when they disappeared without warning? So imagine you are flipping through channels in the fall of 1985 and you stumble onto a show that starts with lasers, explosions, and a guy who can shoot electricity out of his hands. Yeah, that was Misfits of Science. And even if it sounds like your average Saturday morning cartoon, this was full-blown primetime television. A group of superpowered weirdos trying to do good in a world that barely understands them. That was either genius or just way too early for its time. The main character was this lab guy named Billy, played by Dean Paul Martin. Yes, that Martin, as in Dean Martin's son. He's basically the normal one on the team, and he is stuck trying to manage a 7-foot-tall telekinetic man, a guy who can shrink himself, and a teenage girl who can control electricity. Courtney Cox, before Friends, before the Bruce Springsteen video, was that very girl. Back then, most people had no idea who she even was. But you could tell even then, she had something. Now, Misfits of Science came at a time when American television was finally getting weird. Not just oddball humor weird, but full-on, let's throw superpowers into sitcoms and see what sticks kind of weird. But that also meant it was going up against Knight Rider, The A-Team, and the tail end of Mork and Mindy-style experimentation. So unless you were a super fan, there was a good chance you blinked and missed this show entirely. Which is a shame because there was this wild optimism to it, even in how clumsy it could be. The plot? Honestly, it changed week to week. One episode, they were rescuing kidnapped kids with their powers. The next, they were getting involved in a government conspiracy. It was messy, gloriously messy. But at the heart of it all was this sincere belief that being different was not just okay, it was the best thing you could be. And that message hit a little different in the 80s, when standing out usually got you laughed out of the room. But here's the real kicker. NBC had no idea what to do with this show. They marketed it like a kid's superhero romp, but then stuck it in a primetime Friday slot. And Fridays in the 1980s were where shows went to die. Between scheduling chaos, low ratings, and a general misunderstanding of what they had on their hands, the network pulled the plug after just 16 episodes. That's it. 16 episodes and then gone. Looking back, it feels like Misfits of Science predicted a lot of what we love now. Ensemble superhero shows, teens with powers, outsiders finding family in each other. If this exact show had dropped in the early 2000s, or even as a streaming exclusive today, it might have taken off. Instead, it is just a blip. A brightly colored, wild, too ambitious blip from a time when television was still trying to figure out just how weird it was willing to be. And yet, if you were one of the kids who saw it, even just one episode, it stuck with you. You remembered the logo, the clunky effects, the strange friendships, and that nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, you were not the only misfit in the world. There is awkward, and then there is painfully, beautifully, relentlessly awkward. And that is exactly what Square Pegs delivered in every single episode. The year is 1982, and American television is neck-deep in macho action shows, family-friendly sitcoms, and a growing wave of sugary sweet teen programming. But this show looked you dead in the eye and said, high school sucks, and here is why. The main duo, Patty and Lauren, are best friends trying desperately to break into the cool crowd. They wear clothes that never quite fit right, talk with the kind of jittery rhythm that only real teenagers have, and overanalyze every hallway conversation like their lives depend on it. Because to them, they do. This was not glossy, airbrushed television. Square Pegs was messy, hilarious, and painfully honest in the way it portrayed high school anxiety. Sarah Jessica Parker was just a kid then, long before the heels and headlines. Watching her as Patty was like seeing a real girl on screen for the first time. someone who did not always know what to say, who did not have perfect hair, and who was trying so hard to matter in a world that barely noticed her. The show was created by Ann Beats, one of the original writers from Saturday Night Live, and you can feel that energy in every scene. It was satirical, fast-talking, and laced with a sense of humor that did not just punch up, it punched inward. The teachers were weird, the cliques were absurd, but every joke came with a little sting of recognition. You laughed, but also winced, because yeah, you were that kid once. But here is the real tragedy. Square Pegs was too real for its time. It showed teenagers actually dealing with things like body image, social pressure, and the kind of rejection that leaves marks. Not in a heavy-handed after-school special way, but in a this is just how it feels kind of way. And for a lot of people, parents, networks, even some critics, that was a little too uncomfortable. So it was quietly canceled after just 20 episodes. Part of the reason? Behind-the-scenes chaos. Stories of drug use on set, conflicts between producers and network execs, and the fact that no one could quite figure out if it was supposed to be a teen comedy or something deeper. Spoiler, it was both. And maybe that is why it never found its audience. Or maybe it did, and the audience just was not big enough. Still, the show holds up. Weirdly well, actually. It is like a time capsule full of acid-washed jeans, new wave soundtracks, and teenage heartbreak that feels just as sharp now as it did then. You can see echoes of Square Pegs in every awkward high school comedy that came after. From Freaks and Geeks to Daria to Pen 15. They all owe something to this little gem that died too early. So maybe it is fitting that Square Pegs never got its second season. It was a show about not fitting in, and it never really fit into television's neat little boxes either. But for the people who saw it and felt seen because of it, it was unforgettable. There was a time in the early 80s when you could not throw a rock without hitting a sci-fi show about aliens trying to blend in with humans. But the powers of Matthew Starr was different, or at least it wanted to be. This was a show about a teenage alien prince hiding on Earth, trying to survive high school, the government, and whatever alien bounty hunter decided to show up that week. And he did it all with perfect hair and the kind of serious stare that only early 80s drama could deliver. Matthew Starr, played by Peter Barton, was not just a guy with a secret. He was an alien royal from the planet Quadris. He looked human, talked human, lived in suburbia. But deep down, he had telekinetic powers and a destiny waiting somewhere out among the stars. If it sounds like a comic book, that is because it practically was. But the show treated all this with such a straight face that you could not help but go along with it. The real heart of the show, though, was his guardian, Walt Shepard, played by Louis Gossett Jr. Yes, the Louis Gossett Jr., just a year before he won an Academy Award. As his science teacher and secret bodyguard, Walt tried to keep Matthew's powers hidden and his head on straight. The two of them had this quiet bond, like father and son, that gave the show more depth than anyone expected from a Friday night sci-fi drama. But here is the thing. The powers of Matthew Starr was doomed before it really began. The production was cursed with delays, rewrites, and even real-life danger. During one of the early episodes, Peter Barton was badly burned on set during a stunt gone wrong. That changed everything. The tone of the show shifted. The action was scaled back, and by the time it finally aired, no one at the network seemed to know what it was supposed to be anymore. Some episodes were full of space drama and otherworldly threats, and others felt like teen comedies with light sci-fi sprinkled in. The identity crisis was real. One week you got an alien warlord, and the next you got Matthew struggling to ask a girl to the dance. And weirdly enough, that was kind of the charm. Because being a teenager? That does feel like surviving two completely different lives at once. Still, ratings were not kind. The Friday time slot was brutal. Critics shrugged, and most viewers had already moved on to bigger sci-fi names like V or Knight Rider. So after 22 episodes, it was gone. No second season. No epic finale. Just another show that vanished into the static of memory. But here is the part that sticks with you. Even with the cheesy effects, even with the inconsistent tone, the show had heart. Matthew Starr wanted to be more than a superhero or a chosen one. He just wanted to be a normal kid. And in a time when alien stories were all about lasers and explosions, that quiet wish hit different. You may not remember all the plot lines. You probably do not remember the villains. But if you ever saw just one episode, you remember the feeling, that blend of loneliness, hope, and unrealized promise. That was the real power of Matthew Starr. Okay, so imagine Ferris Bueller, but somehow more chaotic, more manipulative, and a little bit dangerous. That was It's Your Move. And the wild part? It starred a young Jason Bateman, years before Arrested Development, playing a teenage schemer so smart and so petty that he could outmaneuver every adult in his life. This was not your typical sitcom. This was a chess match disguised as a comedy. Jason Bateman played Matthew Burton, a high schooler who lived with his single mom and spent most of his time pulling off scams, pranks, and psychological warfare on the grown-ups around him. His biggest target? The neighbor across the hall, Norman Lamb, who also just happened to be dating his mom. So yeah, there were some layers. This was not just a sitcom. It was a cold war between two men, one 14, the other 40, fighting over household territory with stolen mail, booby traps, and fake burglaries. And the writing? Sharp. So sharp, it could cut glass. The show came from the same creators behind Married with Children, so it had that same cynical, sarcastic bite. There were no life lessons at the end of the episode, no tearful apologies, just smart, fast-talking characters trying to get the upper hand. What made the show really sing was Bateman's performance. He was so confident, so in control, that it almost made you uncomfortable. Like, how is this teenager better at manipulating people than most adults I know? But there was a vulnerability there too. You could tell that underneath all the scams and schemes was a kid who felt like the world was slipping away from him. His dad was gone, his mom was moving on, and all he could do was try to stay 2 steps ahead of it all. But like so many shows on this list, It's Your Move flew a little too close to the sun. Viewers loved Bateman, but the tone of the show, dark, biting, and sometimes mean, was not what most families expected at 8:30 on a weeknight. It did not help that some of the pranks were just this side of illegal, and that made networks nervous. Really nervous. So after only 18 episodes, they pulled the plug. The finale tried to soften things a little, dialing back Matthew's edge and letting the war between him and Norman cool off. But by then, the spark was gone. The network folded the whole thing into the archives and moved on. Still, ask anyone who saw it, and they will tell you the same thing. There was nothing else like it. It felt dangerous in a way most sitcoms never dared to be. It made you laugh, but also kind of worry about what you would have done if you were that smart and that angry at the world. And maybe that is why it sticks with people. Because under all the jokes and gags, it was really about a kid trying to control the uncontrollable. And isn't that what being a teenager feels like? If you ever wanted to watch a crime drama that looked like a music video, hit like a mob flick, and felt like a neon-soaked fever dream, Crime Story was it. And that is not an exaggeration. It genuinely felt like something beamed in from another timeline where television was bold enough to feel cinematic every single week. Created by Michael Mann, fresh off Miami Vice, this show took everything stylish about 80s TV and drenched it in grit, blood, and vintage Cadillacs. The story followed Lieutenant Mike Torello, played by Dennis Farina, a no-nonsense cop trying to take down slick mobster Ray Luca across 1960s Chicago and later Las Vegas. Torello had the trench coat, the jawline, and the temper of a man who knew the city was already lost but was not ready to give it up yet. Ray Luca, on the other hand, was the kind of villain who smiled while lighting the match. He was flashy, cruel, and terrifying because he was always one step ahead. But what really set Crime Story apart was the scope. This was not an episode-by-episode procedural. It was serialized, unfolding like a novel, one long cat-and-mouse game that spanned years, cities, and body counts. In the pre-streaming era, this was almost unheard of. Networks did not know what to do with a story you actually had to follow week after week, and if you missed a night, tough luck. There was no DVR, you were out of the loop. Still, the show was fearless. The production design was jaw-dropping. every frame soaked in retro detail, from the music to the clothes to the cars. It felt real, and more than that, it felt dangerous. You could taste the cigarette smoke. You could hear the paranoia in every backroom deal. This was a world where justice felt impossible, and that is what made it so electric. Dennis Farina, a former Chicago cop in real life, gave Torello a weight that never felt acted. He knew how those streets sounded, you could tell. And when his squad of hard-edged investigators backed him up, it felt like something closer to a mob epic than network television. The Untouchables by way of Springsteen. It had that kind of soul. But of course, that ambition came at a price. Ratings were inconsistent. New viewers struggled to jump in mid-arc. The budget ballooned. And by season 2, the story jumped from Chicago to Las Vegas, where it lost some of its grounding and most of its audience. NBC moved it around the schedule like it was a burden, and the show was unceremoniously canceled, ending on a massive cliffhanger that fans still talk about. And maybe that is the most painful part. Crime Story was building towards something, a reckoning, a finale that never came. Instead, it just stopped, like a phone call cut off mid-confession. And you were left staring at the screen wondering what would have happened next. But for the people who did watch, even just a little, the memory of it lingers. The gunmetal blues of Chicago alleys, the bright Vegas lights hiding darkness underneath, and two men on opposite ends of the law locked in a fight they could never walk away from. Crime Story was too bold for its time, and that is exactly why we still remember it. Back in the early 1980s, America was still figuring out what computers could even do. Most people thought they were either terrifying or magic, or both, which is why Automan hit the airwaves like a bolt of glowing neon confusion. This was a show about a holographic superhero created by a genius cop/programmer who steps out of the computer and starts solving crimes in the real world. And yes, it is exactly as wild as it sounds. Desi Arnaz Jr. played Walter, the computer genius with a mullet and a badge. Think of him like a less charming, more earnest Tony Stark with a keyboard instead of a suit. One night, while working late on his artificial intelligence project, he accidentally creates Automan, a glowing, blue-tinted digital man with the voice of a game show host and the confidence of a Saturday morning cartoon. Automan is played by Chuck Wagner, who basically looks like if Superman fell into a vat of Tron. He wears a glowing suit, drives a Lamborghini that can take 90-degree turns without slowing down, and has a floating sidekick called Cursor that draws things into existence. 1 second you need a helicopter, boom, drawn out of thin air. The show was pure fantasy, with 8-bit logic and comic book rules, and it loved every minute of it. And that was its charm. In an era where most cop shows were grounded and gritty, Automan was proudly absurd. It did not want to teach you a lesson. It wanted to show you a glowing guy walking through walls and catching bad guys using vector graphics. It had no business being on primetime television, and yet, somehow, it was. The budget was massive for the time. All those glowing effects? That was real rotoscoping, frame by frame, and it cost a fortune. ABC wanted something to compete with Knight Rider, and they thought this was their ticket. But special effects do not come cheap, and neither does trying to film a weekly sci-fi blockbuster on a television schedule. The ratings just did not hold up. Viewers were confused. Critics were unsure if it was genius or completely off the rails. And before it could finish its first season, ABC pulled the plug after just 13 episodes. No finale, no wrap-up, just gone. A glowing ghost of what could have been. But here is what people do not forget: the look. Automan looked cool. It felt like the future, even if the writing was clunky and the plots were pure 80s cheese. And sometimes, that was enough. In the middle of a decade filled with beige cop dramas and moody private investigators, this weird little show about a glowing man from a computer dared to have fun. Today, Automan feels like a fever dream, like something you only think you remember. But if you ever saw it, even just once, it stuck. Because how could you forget a hologram superhero in a glowing car, saving the world one digitized crime at a time? You would think a show called Fame would be about success, Spotlights, stardom, standing ovations, but it was not. At least, not really. It was about the struggle behind the curtain, the quiet moments, the auditions that went nowhere, the self-doubt no one sees. For 5 years, Fame gave us a musical drama that showed how chasing a dream was often more painful than it was glamorous, and yet somehow we could not look away. The show was based on the 1980 movie of the same name, but instead of just following the loudest and flashiest, the series zoomed in on the students of New York City's high school for the performing arts. Dancers, singers, musicians, actors, all of them teenagers, all of them clawing for a shot at something bigger, and all of them constantly reminded that most of them would not make it. Not because they were not talented, but because the world just works like that. There was Leroy, the dancer with raw energy and a sharp tongue; Bruno, the synth wizard who hated performing live; Doris, who never quite knew who she was supposed to be. These were not caricatures. They were kids who hurt, who fought, who tried, and they were played by actors who gave the kind of performances that made you forget you were watching a television show. But Fame was never just a drama. It was a full-on musical, with performance numbers built into the storyline. And that confused a lot of viewers. One minute, a character would be arguing with their teacher, and the next, they were dancing down a hallway. For some, that felt jarring. For others, it was magic. The real-life version of breaking into song when the emotions got too big to carry. The show tackled issues other teen shows did not dare touch at the time: poverty, abuse, identity, even death. And it did it with a kind of earnestness that could be a little clunky but always felt genuine. This was not slick, polished television. This was gritty and raw and a little awkward, just like the kids it was about. But despite critical acclaim, award nominations, and a fiercely loyal fan base, Fame was always on shaky ground. It started on NBC but got dropped after only 2 seasons. Then it got picked up for syndication, where it continued for 3 more years with a smaller budget and fewer eyes watching. The magic was still there, but it had to fight harder to be seen. By the time it ended in 1987, Fame had outlasted most people's expectations, but not without cost. Cast changes, fading promotion, a world that was starting to lean more into slick sitcoms and simpler narratives. There was no grand send-off, no final bow, just a fade to black. And yet, the echoes of it are still everywhere. Glee, High School Musical, even shows like Euphoria and Smash owe something to Fame. Because Fame was not about getting famous. It was about how you survive when you are young, talented, and terrified. And how sometimes just holding on to the dream is the bravest thing you can do. Let us say you wanted to build the perfect 1980s action show. You would probably start with 2 cool private detectives, right? Make one an ex-army type, the other a surfer-brained computer nerd. Now give them a boat, and a pink helicopter, and a robot named Roboz. That is Riptide, a show that had no business working, but somehow did, if only for a little while. The series followed Cody and Nick, 2 best friends and Vietnam veterans who set up shop on a boat called the Riptide, solving crimes in sunny California. They teamed up with Murray, a tech genius, who brought the brains and the gadgets. Together, they were less of a crack team and more of a chaotic trio, figuring things out with charm, determination, and a ridiculous amount of tech for the time. And that was part of the appeal. Riptide was fun. It never took itself too seriously. One episode might have you chasing jewel thieves, and the next would feature computer hacking that looked more like magic. It was fast, loud, and light on the morals. These guys were not trying to change the world. They were just trying to get paid and not get shot in the process. The chemistry between the 3 leads is what made the show click. Perry King as Nick had that classic leading man swagger. Joe Penny brought the grounded intensity as Cody. And Tom Bray's Murray was the awkward heart of it all, always nervous, always coding, always coming through at the last minute with a gadget that should not work, but somehow did. Then there was the setting. Boats, beaches, neon sunsets. You could almost feel the ocean breeze coming off the screen. It was not deep. It was not trying to win awards. but it was exactly the kind of escapist TV you wanted to turn on after a long day. It gave you the fantasy of adventure without the weight of consequence. Still, Riptide was competing in a crowded space. This was the era of Magnum, P.I., Simon & Simon, and the A-Team. Everyone had a gimmick. And while the show had solid writing and a loyal fan base, it never quite hit breakout numbers. It always felt like the underdog, cool enough to watch, but never the first show anyone mentioned. And after 3 seasons, it just sort of ended. No huge farewell, no dramatic twist. The cases stopped coming. The boat docked. The crew moved on. It was as if the network quietly closed the file and shelved it, hoping no one would notice. But people did notice, because Riptide was comfort food, a show that knew exactly what it was and never pretended otherwise. If you were a kid who loved robots and explosions, or a teen who just wanted to imagine solving crimes with your friends, it stuck with you. Today, it is rarely brought up in 80s retrospectives, but for those who remember, it was a reminder that not every show had to be groundbreaking to matter. Sometimes it just had to be cool. And Riptide, for a few sunny seasons, absolutely was. If you blinked in 1984, you probably missed Legmen. It was one of those blink and it's gone shows, only aired for 8 episodes and then vanished like a rumor. But for the people who caught it, even just once, there was something about it that stuck. It was this strange blend of teen energy and noir mystery, pairing a beach town vibe with hard-boiled cases and college kids doing surveillance work. Yeah, you read that right. College kids, with binoculars, solving crimes. The show followed Jack and David, 2 pre-law students moonlighting as private investigator assistants. Jack was the fast-talking hustler type, played by Bruce Greenwood before he became one of those, "Hey, I know that guy" actors. David was the quieter one, more straight-laced, but clearly addicted to the thrill of it all. Together, they took shady jobs from a grizzled PI who tossed them into cases way above their pay grade. Missing persons, cheating spouses, even mob hits. And sure, it was ridiculous. These guys were 20, tops. One minute they were in class, the next they were breaking into warehouses and getting chased by goons in alleyways. But that was the appeal. It was wish fulfillment for a generation of young adults trying to figure out what came after high school. These guys had no idea what they were doing, but they were doing it anyway. Stylistically, Legmen was trying to be cool. Real cool. It had moody lighting, synth-heavy music, and that soft focus lens that made every night shot look like a dream. You could tell the network wanted it to land somewhere between 21 Jump Street and Magnum P.I., but with more hair gel. The opening credits alone looked like a cologne commercial. But here is the thing. They tried. The writing was tight. The stories, while wild, never insulted the audience's intelligence. And the dynamic between the leads had real potential. It was almost something. But almost does not pay the bills. The problem was timing. Legmen aired in a packed television season, and it never had a chance to find its audience. It was shuffled around time slots like a spare part. There was no major marketing push, no lead-in from a hit show, just a bunch of college-age private eyes chasing shadows in prime time, hoping someone was watching. And no one really was. By the time people figured out what Legmen even was, it had already been canceled. No fan campaigns, no second chances. It went the way of so many promising series, into syndication oblivion, barely mentioned again. But there is something charming about how seriously it took its own premise. It was not a spoof. It was not ironic. These guys really believed they were doing important work, even when they were tripping over their own egos. And in a weird way, that made it more authentic. Because isn't that what being 20 is all about? Thinking you have it all figured out, until the world reminds you otherwise. Legmen never got to grow into what it could have been, but for a few late nights in 1984, it tried to make being young and clueless feel like the beginning of something great. And for a show barely anyone remembers, that is not a bad legacy to leave behind. You would think a sequel to one of the most iconic sitcoms in American history would feel like a cash grab, or worse, a relic trying too hard to stay relevant. But the new Leave It to Beaver pulled off something that most reboots never even get close to. It made nostalgia feel human, not glossy, not ironic, just honest. This was not some next-generation gimmick. This was the real deal. The original cast came back. Jerry Mathers as Beaver, Tony Dow as Wally, Barbara Billingsley still perfectly poised as their mom, June. But now, Beaver was divorced, living with his kids back in his childhood home, trying to hold it together while life kept throwing curveballs he was never trained to hit. That alone made the show stand out. It acknowledged that time had passed, that things had changed. Beaver was no longer the curious kid with wide eyes and a clean haircut. He was a grown man trying to raise his own sons, one rebellious, the other nervous and eager to please. Sound familiar? That was the point. What the new Leave It to Beaver understood better than most was that growing up does not mean growing out of your past. The old house, the old lessons, the feeling that maybe your best days are behind you. It leaned into that gently, with warmth, with regret, with that odd, quiet hope that maybe you were doing okay after all. And yes, it had laughs, plenty of them. But they were different now, softer, sadder even. The humor came from the struggle. Beaver helping his kids deal with bullies, trying to fix leaky plumbing, or facing his ex-wife with a mix of anger and leftover affection. The show did not shy away from the reality of adulthood. It walked straight into it, sleeves rolled up. It also expanded the world without blowing it up. We saw Wally raising his own family, June navigating widowhood with her usual grace. Even Eddie Haskell showed up, older but still slippery, still charming in the worst way. These were not just cameos. They were pieces of a bigger story, one about how the past echoes through everything we do, whether we like it or not. And yet, despite its strong writing and heartfelt approach, the new Leave It to Beaver never got the credit it deserved. It started as a TV movie, then aired on the Disney Channel, then moved to cable. It was always shifting, always somewhere slightly out of reach. It ran for 6 years, longer than most remember, but rarely made headlines. Maybe that is because it was never flashy. It was not trying to reinvent the wheel. It was just trying to tell the next chapter of a story people already loved. And sometimes, that is harder than starting from scratch. In the end, the new Leave It to Beaver was not about reclaiming a golden age. It was about learning how to live after it is gone. And how even the simplest lessons, be kind, be patient, do your best, never really go out of style. It was bold. Too bold, maybe. Hot L Baltimore came from Norman Lear, the mastermind behind groundbreaking hits like All in the Family and Maude. Based on a stage play by Lanford Wilson, the show was set in a rundown hotel filled with outcasts, dreamers, and people society had quietly ignored. Prostitutes, illegal immigrants, transients, they all called the hotel home. And that was exactly the problem. In a time when primetime television was still finding its nerve, Hot IL Baltimore pushed the line so far forward that many stations refused to air it at all. The show tackled sex, poverty, racism, and identity, topics that were still taboo even by Lear's fearless standards. There was no laugh track to soften the edges, just conversations that felt uncomfortably real. Critics were split. Some praised it as raw and unflinching. Others found it too confrontational. And while Lear had managed to make controversy work in the past, this time the balance tipped. Viewers were unsure whether they were supposed to laugh, cry, or change the channel. Ratings were modest. Affiliate pushback was fierce. After just 13 episodes, ABC pulled the plug. Hot L Baltimore was gone. But it left a mark. It showed just how hard television had to fight to reflect real life, and how easy it was for something honest to be labeled too dangerous. Today, the show is rarely mentioned, but it remains a reminder that bravery on screen often pays the price first. There are certain shows that live in the very bones of American pop culture, and The Ed Sullivan Show is one of them. It ran for over 2 decades, from 1948 to 1971, and if you watched television on a Sunday night during those years, chances are Ed Sullivan was part of your weekly rhythm. It was a variety show, yes, but calling it just that feels too small. It was where America saw the Beatles for the first time. It was where Elvis Presley became dangerous, where ventriloquists, dancers, comedians, and opera singers somehow all fit under one spotlight. Ed Sullivan himself was famously stiff, famously awkward, and somehow perfect. He introduced the country to new talent with that signature delivery, and he made Sunday night feel like an event. There was a weight to every booking, like he knew it might shape the future. You did not just see stars, you watched them become immortal. Whether it was a shaky stand-up comic or a fresh-faced rock band, Sullivan gave them the biggest stage in America. And in doing so, he gave us permission to fall in love with something new. But time is cruel, and memory is selective. The black and white glow of the Ed Sullivan Show has dimmed over the years, especially for younger generations who grew up in color. They know the names, but not the feeling. They know the clips, but not the build-up. That moment when the whole family leaned in, waiting to see who Ed had lined up next. Now, the footage lives on in compilations and documentaries, and the stage he made legendary is mostly a footnote. But for a time, it was the heartbeat of America's living rooms. Some shows are just too weird and wonderful to survive. The Adventures of Brisco County Jr. was one of them. Imagine a show that mixed cowboy shootouts with futuristic science fiction, where a Harvard-educated bounty hunter rode horseback through the Wild West chasing outlaws and ancient alien technology. It should not have worked, but somehow it did. Bruce Campbell's Brisco was charming, sharp, and oddly philosophical for a man in spurs. The tone was part Western, part comic book, and part pulp serial, and all heart. It winked at the camera, but never lost its soul. There were glowing orbs, steampunk gadgets, and a subplot about time-traveling artifacts that felt wildly out of place, and yet completely right. It was not just about justice, it was about belief. Belief in progress, in legacy, in the idea that even the Wild West had a future worth dreaming of. But television did not know what to do with it. The ratings were decent, the fan base was devoted, but it was too different, too out there. After one season, it was gone. One of the most original shows of the 1990s disappeared into the void while the world chose safer stories. Now, it lives on in whispers, on fan forums, in dusty DVD collections, in the memories of those who knew television had stumbled upon something special and let it slip away. Brisco County was ahead of its time. Maybe that was the problem. Or maybe the real adventure was just getting to see it at all. In the hierarchy of school sitcoms, head of the class stood alone. This was not about slackers or class clowns. This was about geniuses, the kind of kids who corrected teachers, aced every test, and still had time to argue about Shakespeare. But here is the twist. They were not perfect, not even close. And that is what made the show feel so real. Even while it was set in one of the smartest classrooms television had ever seen, you had Arvid, shy, awkward, brilliant. You had Darlene, confident, sharp, and always ready with a comeback. Dennis, who could solve a math equation with one hand and stir up trouble with the other. And at the center of it all was Mr. Moore, the laid-back teacher who knew the students were smarter than he was and was totally okay with that. He was not trying to be the star. He just wanted to help. The show tackled topics that most sitcoms avoided: academic pressure, self-worth, identity, and even more serious stuff like discrimination and politics. But it did it with a softness, a kind of quiet respect for the intelligence of both the characters and the viewers. It never talked down to you. It invited you to listen, to think, to laugh, and maybe to learn something about yourself. What set Head of the Class apart was that it never made the characters feel like punchlines. They were smart, yes, but they were also scared, awkward, messy, and very human. It was not about being the best student. It was about figuring out how to be a person, which, let's be honest, is harder than any test. If you forgot this show, you are not alone. It never had the biggest ratings or the loudest fan base. But for the kids who watched it, the ones who felt different or too smart or too unsure of how to fit in, it was a quiet kind of lifeline. a reminder that you did not have to be cool to be important, that being smart could be a story worth telling, and that even the brightest students need someone to believe in them. It turns out there was one thing America did not need in 1981, and that was a honeymoon suite full of Brady Bunch leftovers. The Brady Brides tried to keep the sunshine and sibling charm of the original series alive, but the spark just was not there anymore. Instead of a heartwarming reunion, viewers got a weirdly cramped sitcom about two grown sisters who get married, move in together, and spend way too much time arguing over kitchen space. Sounds relatable in theory. In practice, it just made you wonder why anyone thought this needed to happen. The concept picked up right where the Brady Bunch left off, with Jan and Marcia Brady both getting married, on the same day no less. Their husbands were complete opposites, which was supposed to lead to sitcom gold. But instead of clever conflict, it just turned into four people bickering in a shared house. And sure, seeing some of the old cast return was kind of nostalgic. But nostalgia only works when it is earned, not when it is shoved into a lukewarm laugh track. What really made the Brady Brides miss the mark was how awkwardly it tried to juggle the past with the present. The Brady Bunch had always been about sweet resolutions, cheerful morals, and that very specific kind of 1970s optimism. The Brady Brides dumped all that in favor of married life sitcom cliches. Suddenly, Jan was neurotic, Marcia was snippy, and the husbands were just there. The chemistry felt off. The pacing was weird, and the whole thing played like a spin-off that was still waiting for permission to exist. To make things stranger, the original Brady cast was only partially involved. Yes, Florence Henderson made a quick appearance. Yes, Mike Lookinland popped in. But the family you loved? Scattered, sidelined, and sort of hollow. It was like opening a box of cereal and realizing someone took all the marshmallows out. Technically still the same thing, but missing the only part you actually came for. NBC originally aired The Brady Brides as a made-for-television movie, which did fine. But when they expanded it into a full series, the wheels came off fast. The tone did not click with audiences. The writing felt forced, and the charm that had defined the Bradys for years was replaced with awkward adult tension that just was not fun to watch. Viewers had grown up, but the show had not figured out how to grow up with them. By the end of its short run, The Brady Brides felt like a well-intentioned high school reunion that just would not end. You were glad to see familiar faces, but after 10 minutes you remembered why you stopped hanging out with them in the first place. The series was quietly canceled after just 10 episodes. No one made a fuss. No one staged a campaign to bring it back. It was just another spin-off that misunderstood the heart of its source material. And even die-hard Brady fans kind of let it fade into the background, not because it was awful, but because it just did not feel like home. The idea was magic. A group of travelers, scientists, teens, mystics, find themselves trapped in a mysterious dimension where time and reality break down. They search for a way home, journeying through a series of strange lands, each with its own rules, cultures, and dangers. That was The Fantastic Journey. A mix of science fiction and fantasy, it was a show that promised discovery, imagination, and adventure. But what it delivered was something far more chaotic. Despite an ambitious premise, the show was never given the time or budget it needed to build its world. Sets looked recycled. The effects were underwhelming. The writing swerved between philosophical and campy, often within the same episode. One week they were battling telepathic overlords. The next week they were navigating a land of forgotten civilizations. It felt like 3 different shows fighting for control. Characters were introduced and dropped. Storylines never paid off. Even the lead actor was changed mid-season. NBC had hoped for a ratings hit, but the show struggled to build a consistent audience. Viewers were intrigued but also confused. What was the journey, really? Where were they going? And why did it feel like the writers were just as lost as the characters? After only 10 episodes, The Fantastic Journey was canceled. But in those few hours, it captured something unique, a wild, unpolished attempt to blend science fiction with mythology and metaphysics. It did not succeed, but it did not completely fail either. For some, it still lingers as a vivid memory of what television used to try before it learned to play things safe. A weird, winding path through television's stranger corners. The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis was not your average teenage sitcom. It aired from 1959 to 1963 and had one of the most unique voices of its time. This was a show about a lovesick young man who talked directly to the camera, breaking the fourth wall long before it became a storytelling trend. Dobie was charming, hopelessly romantic, and always entangled in some absurd scheme to win over the girl of the week. But what made the show stand out even more was the presence of Maynard G. Krebs, played by Bob Denver, a beatnik sidekick who recoiled at the word work and became a cultural icon in his own right. The show was funny, sharp, and smarter than it often got credit for. It touched on real themes of class, ambition, and teenage rebellion, all wrapped in a light-hearted, lovable package. Dobie wasn't a rebel or a genius. He was something rarer, a sincere dreamer. He wanted love, he wanted meaning, and he wanted it without irony. It was the first time television said it was okay to be awkward, poetic, and hopeful at once. And it let teenagers be foolish without making them the punchline. It gave American youth a voice, an oddball voice maybe, but a voice nonetheless. Over time, though, it was overtaken by louder, brighter comedies and the rise of more dramatic fare. Dobie faded into the background, his monologues forgotten, his daydreams replaced by different kinds of heroes. But if you watched it, really watched it, you remember the warmth, the honesty, the way it made being young feel both ridiculous and profound. There was something strange and beautiful about this show, like a bedtime story wrapped in a sitcom. Nanny and the Professor was about a mysterious English nanny named Phoebe Figalilli, who arrived out of nowhere to care for the chaotic household of Professor Everett and his 3 kids. She had an air of magic about her, never overt, never explained, but always understood. This was not a flashy show. There were no laugh tracks forcing you to find it funny, no obvious special effects screaming for attention. Instead, it asked you to believe, to trust that sometimes the people who save us do not come with explanations. They just show up quietly, like Nanny did, and make life a little better without asking for anything in return. There were whispers that she was psychic. Some thought she was a witch, but it never mattered. What mattered was that she taught 3 kids and a tired, widowed professor how to feel joy again. And for a brief moment in television history, that kind of emotional rescue was enough. When the show ended after just 2 seasons, it left behind a strange sense of unresolved wonder. We never found out who Nanny really was. Maybe that was the point. Some people are not meant to stay. They just pass through when you need them most. Like a childhood memory you can almost remember, but not quite. There was something about Kate and Allie that just felt lived in, not flashy, not loud, just real. 2 divorced women raising their kids under the same roof in a cozy New York apartment, trying to make things work when the world kept telling them it was not supposed to. You do not always think of this one when people list their favorite 80s shows, but the people who grew up with it? They remember it like family. Kate was the free spirit. Allie was the traditionalist. Together, they were balance, raising kids, juggling jobs, figuring out how to start over in the middle of their lives without losing their minds. And they did it without husbands, without a big house, and without pretending like everything was okay when it was not. That was the quiet power of the show. It said, "We are here. We are figuring it out, and that is enough." The laughs were subtle, dry humor, sarcastic glances across the kitchen, the kind of moments that felt like they were written by someone who had actually lived through 1,000 messy mornings and late-night fridge raids. And through it all, Kate and Allie stuck together, not because it was easy, but because it mattered. Their kids, Emma, Jenny, and Chip, added their own chaos, teen drama, homework, arguments over the phone line. But it was never the over-the-top, exaggerated kind. These were the kinds of arguments that happened in your own house. You saw yourself in them. You heard your own voice coming out of those rooms. And maybe that is why the show still lingers in the memory, even if it got buried under glossier titles. It was a blueprint for the way real families live and love, for how women, especially women outside the mold, can create their own version of home. Not with a perfect partner or a suburban fantasy, but with each other, with friendship, with persistence. It did not try to be revolutionary, but it quietly was. In an era of nuclear families and traditional sitcom tropes, Kate and Allie looked different. They sounded different. And they reminded viewers, especially young ones, that the people who show up for you do not always come in the package you expect. If you forgot about Kate and Allie, that is okay. But maybe now is the right time to remember the strength, the honesty, the warmth, and how sometimes your best second chance is standing right beside you in the kitchen, passing the coffee and saying, "We've got this." After MASH ended in 1983, there was only one question left. What could possibly follow it? The answer was AfterMASH, a sequel that brought back a few familiar faces from the original series, but somehow left behind almost everything that made MASH special. The war was over, the humor was different, the setting was new, and the result? It fell apart faster than anyone expected. The idea for AfterMASH was not entirely crazy. MASH had been one of the most beloved shows of all time. The finale alone was watched by over 100 million people, so of course the network wanted to keep the momentum going. In AfterMASH, Colonel Potter, Klinger, and Father Mulcahy return stateside and reunite at a veterans hospital in Missouri. It was supposed to be a thoughtful look at post-war life, and in theory, it could have been. But where MASH had war as a backdrop to explore human nature, AfterMASH had paperwork and waiting rooms. The tension, the chaos, the moral complexity, gone. What was left felt too calm, too safe, and far too slow. But something about it just did not land. The humor felt too forced, the pacing was off, and the writing struggled to find that perfect balance of comedy and heart that MASH had pulled off so well. Instead of feeling fresh, AfterMASH felt like watching someone try to do a magic trick without any of the props. Part of the issue was that it leaned too much into nostalgia without earning it. You could feel the writers wanting you to care as much as you did in Korea. But the stakes were lower now. There were no tents, no war, no choppers in the background. Instead, you got a slow-moving hospital and some meandering drama. It felt less like a continuation and more like a tribute act. Klinger, once the show's comic relief, was now a family man dealing with bureaucracy and small-town politics. Father Mulcahy's hearing loss became a central plot point, but the writing handled it more like a trivia fact than emotional weight. Colonel Potter? Still charming, but without the same spark. These characters had grown, but the show had not. The heart was still there, but it beat a little slower. The world around them had changed, and the show never figured out how to keep up. It was like looking at a painting that used to move you, now hanging under dim lights. The ratings were not terrible at first, but by the second season, the audience was gone. Critics were not kind either. Many said what viewers were already thinking. AfterMASH lacked the edge, the heart, and the bite of the original. It was soft around the edges, and not in a comforting way. By 1985, AfterMASH was canceled quietly. There was no big finale, no fond goodbye, just an awkward fade-out for characters people had once loved deeply. And maybe that is the most tragic part. Not that the show failed, but that it made people forget how much they once cared. Sometimes even science fiction needs a laugh, but Quark never quite found its punchline. This short-lived series tried to parody the genre just as Star Wars fever was gripping the world. It followed a garbage collector in space, Adam Quark, and his bizarre crew aboard a sanitation ship cleaning up interstellar waste. There were clones, robots, alien princesses, and lots of fourth wall-breaking one-liners. The tone was weird, the jokes even weirder. Creator Buck Henry had helped launch Saturday Night Live, and there was hope he could bottle that same absurd genius for network television. But what worked in sketch form did not always translate into 25-minute episodes. Quark constantly wavered between satire and silliness. It poked fun at Star Trek and science fiction cliches, but without much love or warmth for the material it mocked. Some gags were clever, others felt like leftovers. The laugh track made it worse, dulling any potential edge. Critics were puzzled. Audiences were indifferent. NBC shuffled its time slot, hoping something would stick. Nothing did. After just 8 episodes, the show was canceled. But for a brief moment, Quark had aimed for something unique, a space comedy before that was really a thing. And maybe that was the problem. It was ahead of its time, or maybe just off-key. Watching it now, you can see flashes of brilliance under the bad wigs and rubber aliens. But you can also feel the weight of a show that never figured out how to balance satire with storytelling. Quark vanished almost as quickly as it arrived, leaving behind only static in the void. Out of This World was the kind of show that could only exist in the 80s, a sitcom about a teenage girl who discovers on her 13th birthday that her father is an alien and she has supernatural powers. That sounds like something you'd find in the last row of a dusty VHS bargain bin, and honestly, that's the charm. This show somehow managed to blend heartwarming family moments, slapstick comedy, and intergalactic weirdness, all in one neon-washed package. It aired in syndication, which meant it never had a consistent time slot, but Sundays were a regular go-to in a lot of local markets. The lead character, Evie, had the power to freeze time by touching her index fingers together, a trick that was used so often it became one of the most recognizable gags of the show. The real kicker? Her alien dad, who you never actually saw, spoke to her through a glowing cube and was voiced by Burt Reynolds. Yes, that Burt Reynolds. It ran for 4 seasons, but because it was never a network darling and never had rerun deals, it kind of disappeared once the final episode aired. Ask anyone who remembers it and they'll light up with nostalgia, then immediately question if it was a dream. It was campy. It was bizarre. And it was something truly, uniquely 80s. Out of This World might have vanished from the spotlight, but for those who saw it, it never left their memories. Before inclusion became a buzzword, Hang Time quietly lived it. This teen sitcom was centered on a high school basketball team, with one twist. One of the star players, Julie Connor, was a girl, and the series never treated that as a gimmick. It explored what it meant to break into a boy's world, not with magic or rebellion, but with sheer talent and quiet determination. Julie was strong, not because she was written to be, but because she had to be. The show did not just focus on the court, it dove into race, gender, friendship, and pressure. Real issues with no easy answers. It did so with warmth, humor, and sincerity, never talking down to its young audience. Coach Katowinski, the wise mentor figure, often acted as the voice of reason, but never the voice of perfection. Hang Time did not push boundaries, it lived within them, and still showed us how to stretch them from the inside. Its impact was subtle, but deeply felt by viewers who saw themselves in characters finally playing for more than just a win. The teens stumbled, they failed, they fought, and through it all, the team came first. The bond that formed on the hardwood felt genuine, earned, and familiar to anyone who ever played a sport or tried to find their place. Hang Time ran for 6 seasons, but somehow it still slipped through the cracks of nostalgia. Maybe because it never screamed for attention. It just showed up, week after week, doing what great shows do, telling stories that made people feel seen. It was never just about basketball. It was about believing that the game, like life, had room for everyone. You could not watch Perfect Strangers without falling in love with Balki Bartokomous. He came from the fictional island of Mypos, wore vests over sweaters in the middle of summer, and had a heart so big it practically broke through the screen. Then there was Larry Appleton, tightly wound, neurotic, trying way too hard to keep it together in a Chicago apartment that suddenly had to accommodate a wide-eyed cousin who had never used an elevator before. It was a classic odd couple setup, but it had something deeper going on, something that stuck with you even if you forgot all the punchlines. What made Perfect Strangers work was not just the culture clash. Though, yes, there were many hilarious misunderstandings involving vacuum cleaners, pig statues, and whatever strange tradition Balky brought with him from Mypos. It was about connection. Balky and Larry were different in every way, but they were family, and they made each other better, even when Larry was losing his mind over a job interview, and Balky just wanted to dance the dance of joy. The show had heart, not the glossy, overproduced kind, but the kind that creeps up on you in a scene where one cousin messes everything up and the other forgives him anyway. It made room for silliness, like Balky trying to understand American slang, and still managed to teach a whole generation what patience, empathy, and kindness looked like between people who had no reason to get along, but did it anyway. Looking back, Perfect Strangers feels like a quiet rebellion against cynicism. It told you that the world might be confusing and complicated, but a little laughter and a lot of compassion could carry you through. It reminded kids who felt like outsiders that being different was not just okay. It was wonderful. It was joyful. It was worth dancing for. You probably forgot how good it felt to watch these two figure things out together. Maybe you did not remember the names. Maybe you forgot the storylines. But if you ever laughed when someone yelled, "Don't be ridiculous," then it is already part of you. And maybe that is what we all need again. Something silly, sincere, and just strange enough to feel like home. If one of these shows sparked a memory or made you wonder what else we've all forgotten, drop your favorite in the comments, give us a like if it made you smile, and hit subscribe so the good stuff never gets canceled again.